The whispers started the moment Adelaide Parker turned 35, but they became a roar when she reached 42 and still wore no wedding band on her weathered finger. Adelaide stood behind the counter of her general store in Knights Ferry, California, arranging tins of peaches with hands that had grown strong from years of lifting crates and hauling supplies. The afternoon sun of 1878 slanted through the dusty windows, illuminating the fine lines around her eyes and the silver threads that had begun weaving through her dark brown hair. She heard the women outside, their voices carrying through the open door with cruel clarity. "Poor Adelaide," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "She's too old for marriage now. What man would want a woman past her prime?" "A spinster at her age," another voice chimed in. "Such a shame. She had her chance years ago with that banker from Stockton, but she turned him down. Now look at her." Adelaide's jaw tightened, but she continued her work, each movement deliberate and controlled. She had heard it all before. The pity, the judgment, the assumption that her life held no value without a husband. Her store was the most successful in Knights Ferry, her reputation for fair dealing known throughout Stanislaus County, but none of that mattered to the gossips who measured a woman's worth solely by her marital status. The bell above the door jangled, and Adelaide looked up, ready with her practiced smile. But the figure that filled her doorway made her breath catch in her throat. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad he had to turn slightly sideways to enter. His hair, dark as a raven's wing and falling past his collar, was tied back with a leather cord. His face was all hard angles and weathered bronze skin, with eyes the color of storm clouds that swept across her store before settling on her face. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest, "I need supplies, heading up to the high country for the winter." Adelaide found her voice, though it came out slightly breathless. "Of course. What do you need?" He moved through her store with surprising grace for such a large man, his buckskin clothing and thick beard marking him as one of the mountain men who occasionally came down from the Sierra Nevada. Adelaide had seen his type before, men who preferred the wilderness to civilization, but never one who commanded space quite like this. His arms, exposed where he had rolled up his sleeves, were corded with muscle, and she noticed scars crossing his forearms, evidence of a hard life lived in harsh conditions. "Flour, salt, coffee, dried beans," he said, pausing at her fabric section. His large hand, scarred and calloused, reached out to touch a bolt of blue cotton with surprising gentleness. "And some of this. Pretty color." "For your wife?" Adelaide asked, keeping her voice neutral, even as something in her chest tightened. Those storm cloud eyes met hers again, and something flickered in their depths. "No wife. No woman would have me, living the way I do." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "It's for trade. The Miwok women up in the high country, they like the bright colors." Adelaide began gathering his supplies, hyper-aware of his presence as he moved through her store. He was examining everything with careful attention, occasionally picking up an item to inspect its quality. When he reached her shelf of books, a rare smile crossed his weathered face. "Shakespeare," he said, pulling down a worn copy of The Tempest. "Haven't read this in years." Adelaide blinked in surprise. "You read Shakespeare?" "My mother was a schoolteacher back in Ohio," he said, flipping through the pages with reverence. "Made sure I could read before I was 5. Just because a man chooses the mountains doesn't mean he's ignorant." There was no accusation in his tone, just a statement of fact. "I didn't mean to imply," Adelaide began, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "No offense taken, madam." He closed the book carefully and added it to his growing pile. "I'm Ryland Tucker. Most folks call me Ry." "Adelaide Parker," she replied, moving behind the counter to begin tallying his purchases. "This store is mine." "Figured as much," Ryland said, leaning against the counter. His size made her small store feel even smaller, but Adelaide didn't feel threatened. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a flutter of awareness, a feminine consciousness of a masculine presence. "You run it alone?" "For the past 10 years, Adelaide said with quiet pride. "Since my father passed, he left it to me." "Must be hard work for one person." "I manage just fine," Adelaide said, perhaps a bit more sharply than intended. She had spent years proving she could handle the store, handle her life without needing anyone's help. Ryland held up his hands in a placating gesture. and she noticed how his shirt stretched across his chest with the movement. Wasn't suggesting otherwise. Woman who can run a successful business in a town like this has my respect. Adelaide softened, surprised by the genuine admiration in his voice. As she wrapped his supplies in brown paper and twine, she found herself stealing glances at him. He had to be in his mid-40s, she guessed, old enough to have the lines of experience on his face, but still clearly in his prime. The way he moved spoke of strength and capability, and something about his steady presence made her feel oddly safe. "That'll be $23, Adelaide said, finishing her calculations. Ryland counted out the money from a leather pouch, his fingers brushing hers as he handed over the coins. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through Adelaide's system. She pulled her hand back quickly, busying herself with putting the money in her cash box. "You need help carrying these to your horse?" she offered, grateful for an excuse to look away from those penetrating eyes. "I can manage," Ryland said, but he didn't move immediately. "Miss Parker, would you happen to know where a man might get a decent meal in this town? Been on the trail for 3 days, and my own cooking leaves much to be desired." "The boarding house serves supper at 6, Adelaide said. "Mrs. O'Brien is a fine cook." Ryland nodded slowly, still not moving. "Would you consider joining me? I'd appreciate the company, and I'd like to hear more about Knight's Ferry. Haven't been through this area in a few years." Adelaide's heart did an unexpected leap. When was the last time a man had asked her to supper? Years ago, before the gossips had labeled her a hopeless spinster. She opened her mouth to accept, then heard the voices from outside echoing in her memory. What would people say if they saw her dining with this rough mountain man? They already thought her foolish for not marrying when she had the chance. Then, something shifted in Adelaide's chest. Why should she care what they thought? They had already judged her, already decided her fate. What did she have to lose? "I'd like that," she said, meeting Ryland's eyes directly. "I close the store at 5:30. The smile that spread across Ryland's face transformed it entirely, softening the hard edges and revealing the attractive man beneath the weathered exterior. "I'll be back at 5:30 then." Adelaide watched as he gathered his supplies with easy strength, loading his arms with packages that would have required 2 trips for most men. At the door, he turned back, his eyes holding hers for a long moment that made her pulse quicken. "Looking forward to it, Miss Parker," he said, and then he was gone, ducking through the doorway into the afternoon sunlight. Adelaide stood frozen for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the counter. What had she just agreed to? She was 42 years old, long past the age of girlish excitement over a man's attention, and yet her heart was racing, and she felt more alive than she had in years. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Adelaide helped customers with half her attention, the other half occupied with thoughts of Ryland Tucker. She found herself glancing at the clock more often than necessary, watching the hands creep toward 5:30. When Mrs. Henderson came in for thread, Adelaide barely registered her pointed comments about men who lived like savages in the wilderness. At 5:15, Adelaide flipped the sign on her door to closed and hurried to the back room where she kept a small mirror and wash basin. Her reflection showed a woman with flushed cheeks and bright eyes, looking younger than she had in years. She unpinned her hair, brushed it out, and repinned it more carefully, allowing a few soft tendrils to frame her face. Her dress was plain brown calico, practical for working in the store, but it was clean and well-fitted, showing her figure to advantage. Years of physical labor had kept her strong and lean, and she stood straight with the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. The knock on the door came precisely at 5:30. Adelaide took a deep breath, smoothed her skirt, and went to open it. Ryland had cleaned up, she noticed immediately. His hair was still damp, slicked back from his face, and his beard had been trimmed. He wore a clean shirt, still buckskin but without the trail dust, and he had removed his heavy knife belt, though she suspected he still carried a weapon somewhere. The effort he had made touched her more than she wanted to admit. "You look lovely," he said simply, offering his arm. Adelaide accepted, feeling the solid strength of his forearm beneath her hand. As they walked down the main street toward the boarding house, she was acutely aware of the stares they attracted. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open in shock. The banker's wife whispered urgently to her companion. Adelaide held her head high, refusing to show any embarrassment. "Seems we're causing quite a stir," Ryland observed, his tone amused rather than concerned. Small town, Adelaide said. People here have nothing better to do than gossip. Let them talk, Ryland said, covering her hand with his free one in a gesture of support. Their opinions don't mean a damn thing. Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house was a 2-story structure at the end of Main Street, painted white with green shutters. The dining room was already full of boarders and a few townspeople who paid for meals. Adelaide felt the conversations pause as she and Ryland entered, felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Ryland seemed oblivious to it all, guiding her to a corner table with a view of the street. He held her chair with courtly manners that surprised her, then settled his large frame into the chair across from her. The furniture seemed almost comically small beneath him. Mrs. O'Brien herself came to take their order, her eyes sharp with curiosity as they moved between Adelaide and Ryland. Evening, Adelaide. Sir, we have roast chicken tonight with potatoes and green beans. Sounds perfect, Ryland said. And coffee, please. Strong if you have it. Same for me, thank you, Mrs. O'Brien, Adelaide added. As the landlady bustled away, Adelaide became aware of how Ryland's attention settled on her fully, as if she were the only person in the room. It was both flattering and slightly unnerving. So, tell me about yourself, Adelaide Parker, Ryland said, leaning back in his chair. How does a woman come to own the finest general store in Stanislaus County? Adelaide smiled at the compliment. My father opened it 30 years ago, when Knight's Ferry was barely more than a mining camp. My mother died when I was 12, so I grew up working alongside him, learning the business. When he passed 10 years ago, some people thought I should sell it, that a woman couldn't run it alone. She lifted her chin. I proved them wrong. I'd wager you did, Ryland said, respect clear in his voice. Takes strength to go against what people expect. What about you? Adelaide asked, eager to shift the focus. How does a man who reads Shakespeare end up living alone in the mountains? Ryland was quiet for a moment, his expression turning thoughtful. I was married once, long time ago. Her name was Mary. We had a farm in Ohio near where I grew up. She died giving birth to our daughter, and the baby didn't survive either. His voice remained steady, but Adelaide saw the old pain in his eyes. I was 25. After that, I couldn't stand being around people anymore, couldn't stand their pity and their advice about moving on and finding another wife, as if Mary was just a position to be filled. So I sold everything and headed west. That was 20 years ago. Adelaide's heart ached for him. I'm so sorry, Ryland. It was a long time ago, he said. I've made peace with it. The mountains have been good to me. I trap furs in winter, do some gold panning in summer, trade with the Miwok people. It's a solitary life, but it suits me. Or it did, anyway. Did? Adelaide asked, catching the past tense. Ryland's eyes met hers, and she saw something smoldering in their depths that made her breath catch. Past few years, I've been feeling restless, like maybe the mountains aren't enough anymore, like maybe I've been hiding long enough. Mrs. O'Brien arrived with their food, interrupting the moment. Adelaide was grateful for the distraction, needing time to process the intensity of Ryland's gaze. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, but Adelaide was hyper-aware of every movement he made, every time his eyes lifted to her face. Adelaide, Ryland said finally, setting down his fork. Can I be direct with you? Please do, she said, though her heart began racing. I heard what those women said outside your store today, he said, his jaw tightening. About you being too old for marriage. That's the biggest pile of horse manure I've ever heard. Adelaide felt heat rise to her face, embarrassment and anger mixing together. You don't need to— Let me finish, Ryland said gently but firmly. You're one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. But more than that, you're strong, capable, intelligent. Any man with sense would count himself lucky to have you. The fact that you're 42 doesn't make you too old for anything. It makes you ripe for the kind of loving a real man can give. Adelaide stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty and admiration. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, Ryland replied. I just wanted you to know. I'm not a man for pretty words or games. I speak the truth as I see it, and the truth is, those women are fools. Adelaide found herself smiling, then laughing softly. You certainly are direct. Only way I know how to be, Ryland said, returning her smile. Life's too short for anything else. They finished their meal talking about everything and nothing. Ryland told her about life in the high country, about the beauty of the Sierra Nevada peaks covered in winter snow, about tracking mountain lions and trading with the native people who still lived in the remote valleys. Adelaide told him about running the store, about the satisfaction of building something successful with her own hands, about the books she read in the evenings in her small apartment above the shop. The evening passed far too quickly. When they finally left the boarding house, full dark had fallen, and stars blazed overhead in the clear California sky. Ryland walked her back to her store, his presence solid and reassuring beside her in the darkness. At her door, Adelaide turned to face him, reluctant for the evening to end. Thank you for supper. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much. The pleasure was mine, Ryland said. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked one of those loose tendrils of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough from hard work, but impossibly gentle. Adelaide, I need to head up to my winter camp in the mountains, but I'll be back in the spring. Would you allow me to call on you then? Adelaide's breath caught. Was this really happening? Was this magnificent man actually interested in her, Adelaide Parker, the woman everyone had written off as too old for love? I'd like that very much, she said softly. Then I'll count the days until spring, Ryland said. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. Good night, Adelaide. Good night, Ryland. She watched him walk away into the darkness, his tall form eventually swallowed by shadows. Only then did she go inside, climbing the stairs to her apartment in a daze. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Adelaide stared at the ceiling and wondered if she had dreamed the entire evening. But no dream could have conjured the feeling of Ryland's hand on hers, the intensity of his gaze, the conviction in his voice when he called her beautiful. Adelaide thought the memory of Ryland Tucker would fade as the months passed. She was wrong. October gave way to November, and November to December. Winter settled over Knight's Ferry, bringing cold rains and occasional frost. Adelaide ran her store, ordered inventory, helped customers, and went through all the familiar motions of her life. But everything felt different now, colored by the memory of storm-cloud eyes and a deep voice telling her she was ripe for loving. She found herself thinking of him at odd moments. When a trapper came through selling furs, she wondered if Ryland was having success in his lines. When a snowstorm hit the valley, she worried about him in the high country, hoping he was safe and warm. When she read at night, she pictured him reading too, that incongruous image of the rough mountain man absorbed in Shakespeare. The gossips, of course, had a field day with Adelaide's supper with the mountain man. Mrs. Henderson made pointed comments about women who threw themselves at strange men. The banker's wife expressed concern about Adelaide's reputation, but Adelaide found that she didn't care as much as she once would have. Ryland's words had planted something inside her, a seed of defiance that grew stronger each day. Why should she care what narrow-minded people thought? She had spent 42 years living by society's rules, and where had it gotten her? Alone and labeled a failure for not catching a husband. Christmas came and went, celebrated with her usual quiet dinner at the boarding house. The new year of 1879 arrived with little fanfare in the small town. January was cold and wet, and February brought more of the same. But as March approached, Adelaide felt anticipation building in her chest. Spring would come soon, and with spring, if his word was good, would come Ryland Tucker. She caught herself checking her appearance more often in the mirror, noticed herself choosing her dresses more carefully each morning. She was acting like a young girl awaiting her beau, and the realization made her laugh at herself. But she didn't stop doing it. The first wildflowers appeared in early March, purple lupins dotting the hills around Knight's Ferry. Adelaide was arranging a new shipment of fabric when she heard the commotion outside, voices raised in greeting, the sound of a horse's hooves on the packed dirt street. Her heart began to pound before she even looked up. And there he was, dismounting from a large bay gelding, his saddlebags bulging with furs and supplies. He looked leaner than she remembered, his face more deeply tanned from the winter sun reflecting off snow, but his shoulders were just as broad, his movements just as assured. He tied his horse to the hitching post and turned toward her store, and even from a distance, Adelaide saw the moment his eyes found her through the window. The smile that broke across his face made her knees weak. Adelaide's hands trembled as she set down the bolt of fabric. Should she go outside? Wait for him to come in? She felt ridiculous, a grown woman nervous as a schoolgirl. But before she could decide, the door opened and Ryland filled the entrance, blocking out the sunlight. "Hello, Adelaide," he said, his voice washing over her like warm honey. "Hello, Ryland," she managed, proud that her voice came out steady. "You survived the winter." "I did," he said, moving into the store and closing the door behind him, though there were times it got touch and go. Had a late blizzard in February that nearly did me in. He moved closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "But I promised I'd come back to you, and I'm a man of my word." "I'm glad you're safe," Adelaide said, and realized with a start that she meant it more deeply than she had meant anything in a long time. The months of worry hadn't been her imagination. She had genuinely cared about this man's well-being, this man she had spent only one evening with. "Did you think about me?" Ryland asked, moving around the counter with the confidence of a man who knew his presence was welcome. "Because I thought about you. Every day, every night." Adelaide's breath caught as he stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell pine and leather and something essentially male. "Yes," she whispered. "I thought about you." "Good," Ryland said, reaching out to cup her face with one large hand. His palm was warm against her cheek, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "Because I have a question to ask you, Adelaide Parker, and I need to know if I'm alone in feeling this." "What question?" Adelaide asked, though her heart was already answering, already saying yes to whatever he wanted to ask. "I'm 45 years old," Ryland said. "I've lived alone for 20 years. I thought I was content with that life. But then I walked into this store last October, and I saw you, and something shifted inside me. I can't stop thinking about you. Your strength, your pride, your intelligence, the way you hold your head up despite what small-minded people say, the way you look in the morning light coming through these windows." His thumb traced her lower lip, sending shivers down her spine. "I want to court you properly, Adelaide. I want to spend time with you, get to know everything about you. And if you'll have me, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then maybe we can build something together. Something real and lasting." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. "Ryland, I'm 42. I'm too old to have children. I'm set in my ways. I have this store, this life I've built." "I don't care about children," Ryland interrupted gently. "I had my chance at that, and fate decided otherwise. I'm not looking for a young woman to give me sons. I'm looking for a partner, Adelaide, someone strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me. As for your store, I'd never ask you to give it up. I can see it's part of who you are." He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. "Say yes, Adelaide. Give me a chance to prove that you're not too old for anything, least of all love." "Yes," Adelaide breathed, the word coming out on a sob of relief and joy. "Yes, Ryland. Yes." His kiss was everything she had dreamed of during the long winter months, gentle at first, almost reverent, his lips soft against hers despite the roughness of his beard. But as Adelaide melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his broad shoulders, the kiss deepened, became something heated and urgent. Ryland's arms came around her, lifting her against his chest as if she weighed nothing, and Adelaide felt cherished and desired in a way she had never experienced before. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ryland rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since October," he admitted. "So have I," Adelaide confessed, making him chuckle. The sound of footsteps on the wooden sidewalk made them step apart, and Adelaide hastily smoothed her hair and dress. A customer entered, stopping short at the sight of Ryland's imposing figure. But Adelaide served them with her usual efficiency, hyper-aware of Ryland's presence as he moved around her store, examining her inventory with interest. When the customer left, Ryland turned to her with a serious expression. "I need to sell my furs and resupply. But Adelaide, I meant what I said. I want to court you properly. Can I take you to dinner again tonight?" "Yes," Adelaide said, unable to stop smiling. "But I could also cook for you. My apartment upstairs isn't large, but I have a decent kitchen, if you'd prefer something more private." Heat flared in Ryland's eyes. I'd prefer that very much. What time? 7 o'clock? I'll be here. True to his word, Ryland arrived at 7 with wildflowers clutched in one massive hand. Adelaide had closed the store early, giving herself time to prepare a proper meal. She had made roasted chicken with herbs from her small garden, fresh bread, and dried apple pie. Her tiny dining table was set with her mother's good china, and she had changed into her best dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes. Ryland had cleaned up again, his hair still damp and curling slightly at his collar. He looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and Adelaide felt beautiful under his gaze. They talked through dinner, picking up conversations from months ago and starting new ones. Ryland told her about his winter, about the cabin he had built years ago in a remote valley, about tracking elk through deep snow and the profound silence of the mountains in winter. Adelaide told him about running the store through the slow winter months, about the books she had read, about her small acts of rebellion against the town gossips. I stopped caring what they think, Adelaide admitted over pie. Or at least, I care less. You helped with that. How so? Ryland asked, leaning back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. You saw me differently than they do, Adelaide said, meeting his eyes. You saw strength instead of stubbornness, capability instead of unfeminine pride. You made me remember who I am beyond their labels. I only saw the truth, Ryland said, but I'm glad I could help you see it too. After dinner, they sat together on Adelaide's small sofa, talking until late into the night. At some point, Adelaide found herself leaning against Ryland's solid shoulder, his arm around her waist, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When he finally left, well after midnight, he kissed her again at the top of the stairs, this time with a restrained passion that promised more when the time was right. Sleep well, Adelaide, he murmured against her lips. You too, Ryland. Over the next weeks, Ryland became a fixture in Knight's Ferry. He took a room at the boarding house and began helping Adelaide with the heavy work around her store, moving crates and barrels that had previously required 2 men or clever leverage. The townspeople watched with undisguised curiosity as the romance blossomed between the spinster shopkeeper and the mountain man. Adelaide found herself happier than she'd been in years, maybe ever. Ryland was attentive without being smothering, respectful of her independence while making clear his desire to be part of her life. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together in the store during the day, sharing meals in the evening, stealing kisses when no customers were watching. But not everyone in Knight's Ferry was pleased with this development. Mrs. Henderson made increasingly pointed comments about appropriate behavior for women of a certain age. The banker's wife expressed concern that Adelaide was making a fool of herself. Even some of Adelaide's regular customers began shopping elsewhere, disapproving of her unconventional romance. Adelaide tried not to let it bother her, but one day in late March, after a particularly cutting comment from a woman she had considered a friend, she found herself fighting tears as she restocked shelves. "Hey!" Ryland's deep voice came from behind her. His hands settled on her shoulders, strong and warm. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Adelaide said, but her voice cracked. Ryland gently turned her around, tipping her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "Tell me." "It's stupid," Adelaide said, wiping at her eyes. "Just more gossip. Mrs. Carson said I was cradle robbing, that you're only interested in me because you need somewhere to stay, that I'm fooling myself if I think a man like you could truly want a woman my age." Ryland's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his storm-cloud eyes. "That's the biggest load of—" He stopped, took a breath, clearly controlling his temper. "Adelaide, look at me. Do I look like a man who needs anyone's charity? I've been taking care of myself for 20 years. I have money saved from trapping. I have my land in the mountains. I could go anywhere, be with anyone, but I choose to be here, with you, because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known." "But I'm 42, Adelaide whispered. "You could have a younger woman, someone who could give you children, someone—" "I don't want a younger woman," Ryland interrupted firmly. "I want you. Your strength, your wisdom, your experience. Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a woman who has lived, who has survived, who has built something meaningful with her own hands. I see someone who knows who she is and doesn't apologize for it. That's worth more than youth, Adelaide. That's worth everything." He pulled her into his arms, and Adelaide let herself lean into his strength, breathing in his familiar scent. "I love you," Ryland said into her hair. "I should have said it before now. I love you, Adelaide Parker. Not in spite of your age, but because of everything you are, everything you've become. And if people in this town can't see how lucky I am, that's their failing, not yours." Adelaide pulled back to look at him, her heart overflowing. "I love you too," she said. "I think I've loved you since that first night when you told me those women were fools." Ryland's answering smile was brilliant. He kissed her deeply, not caring that they were in the store where anyone could walk in and see. When they finally broke apart, Adelaide was breathless and dizzy with happiness. "Marry me," Ryland said, the words blunt and honest, so perfectly him. "I know it's fast, but I'm too old to play games. I want you as my wife, Adelaide. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. Say yes." Adelaide didn't hesitate. "Yes?" The wedding took place in early April, on a warm spring day when the hills around Knight's Ferry blazed with wildflowers. They held the ceremony at the small church with only a handful of guests. Mrs. O'Brien came, beaming with approval. The owner of the lumber mill and his wife attended, longtime customers who had always treated Adelaide with respect. A few others came, people who valued Adelaide enough to look past convention, but many stayed away, making their disapproval clear. Adelaide wore a simple blue dress, the color of the fabric Ryland had admired on their first meeting. She had sewn it herself, working on it in secret in the evenings. Ryland wore new trousers and a white shirt, his long hair tied back, his beard freshly trimmed. When Adelaide walked down the short aisle toward him, the look on his face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The ceremony was brief. The minister, an elderly man who had known Adelaide since she was a girl, spoke about love finding its time and season, about the courage it took to seize happiness when it was offered. When Ryland slipped a simple gold band onto Adelaide's finger, his hands were steady, his voice firm as he made his vows. "I promise to honor you, cherish you, and stand beside you for all my days," he said, his storm-cloud eyes locked on hers. "You'll never doubt your worth again, Adelaide, not while I have breath in my body to tell you how extraordinary you are." Adelaide's vows were equally simple and heartfelt. "I promise to be your partner, your equal, your love, to face whatever comes together with strength and courage. You've given me back myself, Ryland. I'll spend the rest of my life showing you what that means to me." The kiss they shared as husband and wife drew a few scandalized gasps from the small congregation, passionate and deep and full of promise. But Adelaide didn't care. She was married to the man she loved, and the opinions of narrow-minded gossips had lost their power over her. The reception was held at the boarding house where Mrs. O'Brien had prepared a feast. There was music and dancing, and Adelaide found herself swept around the floor in Ryland's strong arms, laughing with pure joy. He was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, moving her through the steps with easy confidence. "Happy?" he murmured in her ear as they swayed to a waltz. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Adelaide replied honestly. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Ryland and Adelaide slipped away from the reception. They climbed the stairs to Adelaide's apartment, now their apartment, closing the door on the world outside. Ryland had lit candles earlier, Adelaide realized, their warm glow filling the small space. He had also brought up wildflowers, arranging them in jars around the room. The thoughtfulness of it made her throat tight with emotion. "I wanted it to be special for you," Ryland said, suddenly looking uncertain. "I know my ways are rough, but Adelaide, She silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her love and gratitude and desire into it. "It's perfect," she whispered against his lips. "You're perfect." What followed was a revelation. Adelaide had been kissed before, had even allowed a few liberties to the banker from Stockton all those years ago, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of Ryland's lovemaking. He was tender and patient, his large hands gentle as they undressed her, his voice a constant murmur of praise and reassurance. He treated her body like something precious, something to be worshipped, and Adelaide felt beautiful under his touch in a way that had nothing to do with age or society's standards. Later, lying wrapped in his arms in her narrow bed, Adelaide traced the scars on his chest with gentle fingers. "Tell me about these," she said softly. Ryland's voice rumbled in his chest as he spoke. "This one's from a mountain lion, Caught me by surprise, my second winner in the mountains. This one's from a knife fight with a claim jumper who thought I'd be easy pickings. This one's just from being careless with an axe." He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I'm not a refined man, Adelaide. My life has been hard and often violent. But I swear to you, I'll use this strength to protect you, not harm you. You're safe with me, always." "I know," Adelaide said, meaning it. She had never felt safer than she did in this moment, wrapped in the arms of this fierce, gentle man who had chosen her above all others. They talked long into the night, making plans for their future. Ryland wanted Adelaide to keep the store if she wished, though he would help her run it. In the summers, if she was willing, they could travel to his mountain cabin, and she could see the wilderness he loved so much. In the winters, they would stay in Knight's Ferry, maintaining the business that Adelaide had worked so hard to build. "We'll make it work," Ryland said with quiet confidence. "Together, we can do anything." Adelaide believed him. The months that followed were among the happiest of Adelaide's life. She and Ryland settled into married life with surprising ease, despite their very different backgrounds. Ryland proved himself invaluable in the store, his strength making quick work of heavy labor, while his honest, straightforward manner with customers won over even some of Adelaide's harshest critics. It was hard to maintain prejudice against a man who would cheerfully help you load your wagon or track down a rare supply item without complaint. The gossips gradually quieted, faced with the undeniable evidence of a successful marriage. Adelaide and Ryland were clearly happy together, their love evident in every glance and touch. Even Mrs. Henderson eventually stopped making pointed comments, though she never quite approved. In June, as Adelaide had promised, they made the journey to Ryland's mountain cabin. They traveled on horseback, Adelaide riding a gentle mare that Ryland had bought for her, their supplies packed on a sturdy mule. The journey took 3 days, climbing higher into the Sierra Nevada with each passing mile. Adelaide fell in love with the wilderness almost as deeply as she had fallen in love with her husband. The towering pines, the crystal-clear streams, the vast expanses of meadow carpeted with wildflowers, all of it spoke to something deep in her soul. And the cabin, when they finally reached it, was far more substantial than she had expected. Ryland had built it himself over the years, a solid log structure with a stone fireplace and real glass windows. Inside, it was surprisingly cozy, with a large bed covered in furs, shelves full of books, and even a rocking chair by the fire. He had made a home here, she realized, a true home, and now he was sharing it with her. They spent 6 weeks in the mountains that summer, and Adelaide discovered aspects of herself she had never known existed. She learned to track game, to read the weather in the clouds, to move quietly through the forest. Ryland was a patient teacher, praising her successes and gently correcting her mistakes. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, reading aloud to each other or simply talking, and Adelaide felt a peace she had never known in civilization. She also met some of the Miwok people Ryland had mentioned, families who lived in the remote valleys and maintained their traditional ways. They welcomed Adelaide with cautious friendliness, and she quickly understood why Ryland respected them so much. Their knowledge of the land was profound, their way of life sustainable and elegant in its simplicity. Adelaide traded cloth and supplies for baskets and knowledge, learning about native plants and medicines that would have horrified her town doctor, but which clearly worked. In August, they returned to Knight's Ferry, tanned and healthy and more deeply in love than ever. The store had been managed in their absence by a young clerk Adelaide had hired, and business had thrived. Adelaide threw herself back into running the shop while Ryland took on the heavy maintenance she'd been putting off for years, repairing the roof and reinforcing the foundation. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of rain, Adelaide realized something that made her sit down abruptly behind her counter. She was late, not by much, just a week or so, but at 42, her cycles had become regular as clockwork, and she had been feeling oddly tired lately, her breasts tender. It wasn't possible, she told herself. Women her age didn't get pregnant, certainly not after just a few months of marriage, but the symptoms persisted, and finally she made a quiet visit to the midwife who lived on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Murphy was a practical woman in her 60s who had delivered half the babies in Stanislaus County. She examined Adelaide thoroughly, asked pointed questions, and finally sat back with a knowing smile. "Well, Adelaide Tucker, congratulations," she said. You're about 2 months along, I'd say. Baby should come in April. Adelaide sat frozen, her mind refusing to process the information. But I'm 42, she whispered. That's not possible. Possible enough, Mrs. Murphy said with a chuckle. You wouldn't be the first woman to conceive later in life. Though I won't lie to you, it'll be harder on your body than it would have been 20 years ago. But you're strong and healthy. I don't see why you shouldn't have a fine baby come spring. Adelaide walked back to the store in a daze. Pregnant. She was going to have a baby, Ryland's baby. Joy and terror warred inside her chest. What if something went wrong? What if she lost the baby like Ryland had lost his first child and wife? What if her age made complications inevitable? But underneath the fear was a bubbling excitement she couldn't suppress. A baby. After all these years of believing motherhood would never be hers, she was going to have a child. Ryland took one look at her face when she returned and immediately closed the store, ushering her upstairs. What's wrong? Are you sick? Should I fetch the doctor? I'm pregnant, Adelaide blurted out, and watched shock ripple across her husband's face. He sat down heavily on the sofa, staring at her. Pregnant, he repeated. The midwife confirmed it. Due in April. Adelaide twisted her hands together. I know we didn't plan for this. I know it might be dangerous at my age. I know. She found herself swept into Ryland's arms, lifted off her feet and spun around as he let out a whoop of pure joy. When he set her down, his eyes were wet with tears. A baby, he said, his voice choked. Adelaide, we're going to have a baby. You're not upset? Adelaide asked, her own tears starting to fall. Upset? I'm the happiest man alive. Ryland cupped her face in his hands, kissing her with overwhelming tenderness. I never thought I'd have another chance at this. I thought that dream died with Mary. But here you are, my magnificent wife, giving me more than I ever dared hope for. I'm scared, Adelaide admitted. What if something goes wrong? Then we'll face it together, Ryland said firmly. But Adelaide, you're the strongest woman I know. If anyone can do this, it's you, and I'll be right beside you every step of the way. True to his word, Ryland became impossibly protective as Adelaide's pregnancy progressed. He took over all the heavy work in the store, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a bolt of fabric. He made sure she ate properly, often cooking meals himself when he thought she wasn't getting enough nutrition. He read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on, becoming an expert on what to expect. Adelaide found his hovering both touching and occasionally irritating. She wasn't an invalid, she would remind him. She had run this store alone for 10 years. But she also couldn't deny that she appreciated his care, especially as her body began to change and her energy waned. The town's reaction to her pregnancy was mixed. Some women, even some who had gossiped cruelly about her, seemed to soften, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Others maintained that it was unseemly for a woman her age to be having a baby, that she was setting herself up for heartbreak. Adelaide ignored them all, focusing on the life growing inside her. As winter arrived and her belly swelled, she found herself talking to the baby, telling it stories about its father, about the mountains they would visit together, about the store that would one day be its inheritance. Christmas that year was special. Ryland carved a cradle from pine, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and Adelaide sewed tiny clothes with shaking hands, still hardly believing this was real. They spent the holiday quietly, just the two of them, dreaming about the family they were creating. January and February passed slowly. Adelaide grew increasingly uncomfortable, her back aching and her sleep disturbed. But every time she felt the baby move, every time she saw Ryland's face light up when he placed his hand on her belly and felt a kick, all the discomfort was worth it. March arrived with warm breezes and blooming wildflowers. Adelaide was enormous now, waddling more than walking, but she refused to stop working entirely. Mrs. Murphy came by weekly to check on her, pronouncing her in excellent health despite her age. This baby has a strong heartbeat, the midwife said during one visit. Should come right on time, I'd say. Adelaide was closing the store on a warm April evening when the first pain hit. She gasped, gripping the counter for support, feeling her belly tighten like a fist. When it passed, she stood still for a moment, breathing deeply. Another pain followed 20 minutes later, then another after that. Ryland, she called, her voice surprisingly calm. I think it's time. Her husband appeared from the back room as if summoned by magic, his face going pale under his tan. Are you sure? Very sure, Adelaide said, gripping his arm as another contraction rolled through her. The next hours passed in a blur. Mrs. Murphy arrived, taking over with calm competence, sending Ryland to boil water and fetch clean linens. Adelaide labored through the night, walking when she could, resting when she must, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Ryland never left her side, holding her hand, murmuring encouragement, his face etched with concern and love. When the pain became overwhelming, when Adelaide was sure she couldn't continue, he would stroke her hair and remind her how strong she was, how proud he was of her. "You can do this, Adelaide," he said over and over. "You're the strongest person I know. Just a little longer, my love. Just a little longer." As dawn broke, painting the sky pink and gold, Adelaide felt an overwhelming urge to push. Mrs. Murphy examined her and nodded with satisfaction. "It's time," she said. "On the next pain, push as hard as you can." Adelaide bore down with all her strength, Ryland supporting her back, his voice in her ear telling her she was doing beautifully. Again and again she pushed, exhausted beyond measure, but driven by a primal need to meet her child. And then, with one final push, she felt the baby slide free, and a lusty cry filled the room. "It's a boy," Mrs. Murphy announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A big, healthy boy." Adelaide collapsed back against Ryland, tears streaming down her face as the midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets. Then, Mrs. Murphy was placing the bundle in Adelaide's arms, and she was looking down at the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He had dark hair like his father and storm cloud eyes that seemed to look directly at her with ancient wisdom. His face was red and scrunched from crying, but to Adelaide, he was absolutely perfect. "Hello, little one," she whispered, touching his tiny hand with one finger. "I'm your mother." The baby's fingers closed around hers with surprising strength, and Adelaide felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. Ryland was staring at his son with wonder, tears running unchecked down his face. "Huh, he's perfect," he said hoarsely. "Adelaide, he's absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Adelaide asked, and carefully transferred the baby to his father's arms. Watching her enormous, rough mountain man husband cradle their tiny son with such exquisite gentleness, Adelaide felt complete in a way she never had before. "This," she thought, "this is what I was waiting for. Not marriage for marriage's sake, not motherhood because society demanded it, but this perfect moment with this perfect man and this perfect child." "What should we name him?" Ryland asked, unable to take his eyes off the baby. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her son's serious little face, Adelaide knew. "Raphael," she said. "For my father. His middle name was Raphael." "Ryland Tucker," Ryland said, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Raphael. Welcome to the world, son." Mrs. Murphy stayed for several hours, making sure both Adelaide and the baby were doing well. She pronounced them both healthy and left with instructions for Adelaide's recovery. Ryland, despite having been awake for over 24 hours, refused to rest, too enthralled with his new son to even consider sleep. "I can't stop looking at him," he admitted, sitting beside Adelaide on the bed, the baby nestled between them. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and this will all have been a dream." "It's real," Adelaide assured him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We're a family now." The first weeks with Raphael were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby was healthy and strong, nursing well despite Adelaide's initial fears that she wouldn't be able to feed him. Ryland was an attentive father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with Raphael when he was fussy, handling his son with a confidence that belied his nervousness. The townspeople came by to visit, bearing gifts and well wishes. Even Mrs. Henderson admitted that Raphael was a beautiful baby, though she couldn't resist adding that it was lucky he was healthy, given Adelaide's advanced age. Adelaide simply smiled and thanked her for the casserole, refusing to let anything diminish her joy. As spring turned to summer, Adelaide healed and regained her strength. Running the store with a baby was challenging, but she and Ryland worked out a system. They created a safe area behind the counter where Raphael could sleep or play, and they took turns managing customers and caring for their son. The baby became a fixture in the store, and customers would often linger just to admire him or make silly faces to earn his smiles. In July, when Raphael was 3 months old, they made the journey to the mountain cabin. Adelaide had been nervous about taking such a young baby into the wilderness, but Mrs. Murphy had assured her that fresh air and exercise would do them all good. The trip was slower this time, with frequent stops to nurse and change Raphael, but Adelaide found herself even more in love with the mountains now that she could share them with her son. Raphael thrived in the wilderness, his cheeks growing rosy from the mountain air. They would take him on walks, bundled securely in a carrier that Ryland had fashioned from leather and soft cloth, showing him the wonders of the forest. In the evenings they would sit outside the cabin, Adelaide nursing the baby while Ryland read aloud, and Adelaide thought she had never been happier. The Miwok women who visited were delighted with Raphael, teaching Adelaide songs and traditional ways of caring for babies that proved surprisingly effective. One elderly woman, whom Ryland called Grandmother Willow, spent hours with Adelaide, sharing wisdom about motherhood and life. "You are blessed," Grandmother Willow said one afternoon, watching Adelaide play with Raphael in the meadow near the cabin. "To find love when you thought it was too late, to have a child when you thought it impossible. The spirits smile on you." "I know," Adelaide said, bouncing Raphael on her knee and making him giggle. "I'm grateful every day." They returned to Knight's Ferry in late August, all three of them healthy and happy. The store had been well maintained in their absence, and Adelaide slipped back into running it with practiced ease. Raphael continued to grow, reaching all his milestones on time or early, proving himself to be a bright, curious child. As autumn approached, Adelaide realized with a start that it had been over a year since she and Ryland had married. In that time, her entire life had transformed. She had gone from lonely spinster to beloved wife and mother. She had found love, purpose, and joy beyond anything she had imagined possible. One evening, after Raphael was asleep in his cradle and they were sitting together on the sofa, Adelaide turned to her husband. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day in the store?" she asked. "When you bought the Shakespeare?" Ryland smiled, pulling her closer. "I said a lot of things that day." "You said just because a man chooses the mountains doesn't mean he's ignorant," Adelaide reminded him. "I think I knew then that you were different from any man I'd ever met." "And do you remember what I said at dinner that night?" Ryland asked, his hand tracing idle patterns on her arm. "When I told you that you weren't too old for anything?" "That you thought I was ripe for a real man's kind of loving," Adelaide said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks even after all these months. "I was right," Ryland said, tipping her face up to his. "You are. And Adelaide, I plan to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Adelaide melted into him, grateful beyond words for the day he had walked into her store and changed everything. The years that followed were full and rich. Raphael grew into a sturdy, intelligent boy with his father's storm cloud eyes and his mother's determination. When he was 2, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise. This time, she delivered a daughter, whom they named Rose, after Ryland's mother. Rose was a placid baby with Adelaide's brown hair and Ryland's easy smile, the perfect complement to her energetic older brother. The store continued to thrive, becoming even more successful as Adelaide's reputation for honesty and quality spread throughout the county. Ryland proved to have a gift for business, his straightforward nature and impressive physical presence making him an excellent partner. Together, they expanded the store, adding new lines of products and even opening a small trading post that specialized in furs and mountain goods. Each summer, they would close the store for a few weeks and journey to the mountain cabin, introducing their children to the wilderness that had brought their parents together. Raphael and Rose learned to track and fish, to respect the land and the native people who lived there, to appreciate both civilization and the untamed wild. Adelaide sometimes thought about the woman she had been before Ryland Tucker walked into her life. That lonely woman who had believed herself too old for love, too set in her ways to change. She barely recognized that person anymore. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, who had found love when everyone said it was too late, who had built a family and a legacy that would endure. The townspeople who had once gossiped about her now spoke with respect. Adelaide Tucker was a pillar of the community, a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother, and the wife of a man who clearly adored her. Even Mrs. Henderson eventually admitted that perhaps she had been wrong about Adelaide being too old for marriage. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Adelaide and Ryland left the children with Mrs. O'Brien and rode out to a meadow overlooking Knight's Ferry. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and wildflowers carpeted the ground around them. 10 years, Adelaide marveled, sitting beside Ryland on the blanket he had spread. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you walked into my store. Sometimes it feels like I've known you my whole life. Best 10 years of my life, Ryland said, pulling her close. Adelaide, I spent 20 years alone in those mountains, convinced I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it. But I was wrong. Life gave me a second chance, and it was even better than the first. You, Raphael, Rose, our life together, it's everything I never knew I needed. They said I was too old, Adelaide remembered, smiling at the memory of those cruel voices. Too old for marriage, too old for love, too old for children. They said I'd missed my chance. They were fools, Ryland said, echoing his words from their first meeting. You weren't too old. You were exactly the right age, ripe for my kind of loving, just like I said. Adelaide laughed, the sound full of joy and contentment. You certainly proved that. As the sun dipped below the horizon and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ryland kissed his wife with all the passion and tenderness of their first kiss 10 years ago. Adelaide kissed him back, grateful for every moment that had led her to this place, to this man, to this life. She had been told she was too old for love, too old for marriage, too old for happiness. But love, Adelaide had learned, had no age limit. It came when it was meant to, and when it did, it transformed everything. She had waited 42 years for Ryland Tucker, but he had been worth the wait. Every moment of loneliness, every whispered criticism, every lonely night had been leading her to him. And now, surrounded by the beauty of the California wilderness, held in the arms of the man who loved her exactly as she was, Adelaide Tucker knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not too old, not too late, but precisely on time for the greatest love story of her life. Their children grew strong and capable. Raphael, at 15, was already as tall as his father, with the same broad shoulders and quiet confidence. He worked in the store with ease, having inherited both his mother's business sense and his father's way with people. Rose, at 13, was developing into a thoughtful young woman with Adelaide's intelligence and Ryland's love of the wilderness. Both children knew they were loved fiercely, and both had grown up understanding that their mother's story was one of courage and defiance of convention. Adelaide was 57 now, her hair more silver than brown, but she moved with the vitality of a much younger woman. Years of physical labor in the store and summers in the mountains had kept her strong. Ryland, at 60, still had the build of a man in his prime, though his hair was completely silver now, which Adelaide thought made him even more handsome. The store had become an institution in Knight's Ferry, a gathering place where people came not just for supplies, but for advice, for news, for the sense of community that Adelaide and Ryland had built. They employed several people now, giving Adelaide and Ryland more time to enjoy their family and their life together. One afternoon in early spring, 15 years after their wedding, Adelaide was working in her garden behind the store when she heard familiar footsteps. She looked up to see Ryland approaching, a letter in his hand and a strange expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Letter from the land office," Ryland said, sitting beside her on the garden bench. "That parcel of land adjacent to my mountain property has come up for sale. Prime land, Adelaide, with water rights and timber. If we bought it, we could expand, maybe build a larger cabin, or even develop it for Raphael and Rose someday." Adelaide considered this, her mind already calculating costs and possibilities. "Can we afford it?" "We can," Ryland said. "Business has been good. Very good. But Adelaide, I won't do it unless you want to. That land represents more time in the mountains, maybe eventually moving there permanently when we're older and ready to retire. I need to know that's something you'd want." Adelaide looked at her husband, this man who had given her everything, who still consulted her on every major decision, who had never once taken her agreement for granted. "I love the mountains," she said honestly. "I love our cabin, our summers there. The idea of having more land, of building something for our children. Yes, I want that. But Ryland, I need to know you won't regret it if we don't move there permanently for many years. The store is my legacy, too. I know, Ryland said, taking her hand, and I respect that. We'll keep the store as long as you want, train Raphael to eventually take it over if that's what he wants. But Adelaide, I like knowing we have options. I like knowing that we've built something together that gives us freedom to choose. Then let's buy the land, Adelaide decided. Let's keep building our future. They purchased the property, and that summer, the whole family traveled to the mountains to explore their new land. It was even more beautiful than Ryland had described, with meadows and forests and a clear stream running through it. They spent weeks there, Ryland and Raphael beginning to plan improvements while Adelaide and Rose explored, gathering herbs and learning the patterns of the land. One evening, Adelaide stood at the edge of a meadow, watching the sunset paint the sky with fire. Ryland came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her head. "Happy?" he asked, a question he had asked 1,000 times over the years. "Always," Adelaide replied, which was always her answer. "Ryland, do you ever think about what our lives would have been like if you hadn't walked into my store that day?" "Sometimes," Ryland admitted. "I think I'd still be alone, telling myself I was content, but knowing deep down I was just existing, not living. And you?" "I think I'd have closed myself off completely," Adelaide said. "Grown old and bitter, proving everyone right about me being a dried-up spinster. You saved me from that, Ryland. You showed me I was wrong about myself, about what was possible." "We saved each other," Ryland corrected gently. "You showed me I could love again, that I could have a family. You gave me Raphael and Rose. You gave me a home and a purpose beyond just surviving." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Adelaide thought about the journey that had brought them here, all the unexpected turns and unlikely blessings. She thought about the woman she had been at 42, convinced her life was settled and small, and marveled at how wrong she had been. Life, she had learned, was full of surprises. Love could come at any age, in any form. The key was being brave enough to reach for it when it appeared, regardless of what anyone else thought. As Ryland led her back to the cabin, their fingers intertwined, Adelaide sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. For this man, for their children, for the life they had built together against all odds and expectations, for the courage to ignore the voices that said she was too old, too late, too set in her ways. Those voices had been wrong. Adelaide Parker Tucker was living proof that it was never too late for love, never too late for happiness, never too late to begin again. She was exactly the right age, at exactly the right time, for exactly the right person. And that made all the difference. Years continued to pass in their blessed rhythm. Raphael grew into a fine young man who eventually did take over the store, proving himself every bit as capable as his parents. At 23, he married a sensible young woman from Stockton, and Adelaide found herself becoming a grandmother, a role she embraced with joy. Rose, independent and spirited, chose to attend normal school in San Francisco, determined to become a teacher like her paternal grandmother had been. Adelaide and Ryland gradually stepped back from the daily operations of the store, spending more time in their mountain property, which they had developed into a true homestead. They had built a larger cabin with a real bedroom and a kitchen that Adelaide loved. They had cleared land for a garden and a small orchard, and Ryland had built a workshop where he crafted furniture during the long winter months. On Adelaide's 65th birthday, Ryland gave her a book. But not just any book. It was a leather-bound journal filled with his handwriting. "What is this?" Adelaide asked, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "Our story," Ryland said. "I've been writing it for the past year. Everything I remember from the day I walked into your store to now. I wanted our grandchildren to know how we found each other, how we built this life. I wanted them to know that love doesn't follow anyone's schedule but its own." Adelaide opened the book with trembling hands, reading the first page. The moment I saw Adelaide Parker, I knew my life was about to change. She stood behind that counter like a queen surveying her kingdom, and I thought, that's a woman who knows her worth. I wanted to know her, wanted to be worthy of knowing her. Tears blurred Adelaide's vision as she read her husband's words, seeing their story through his eyes. The love, the respect, the absolute certainty that they were meant for each other. It was all there in his careful script. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me," Adelaide whispered. "You're the most beautiful gift I've ever received," Ryland replied. "Every day with you has been a blessing, Adelaide. Every single day." They celebrated that birthday surrounded by family. Raphael and his wife brought their children, 3 boisterous grandchildren who filled the house with laughter. Rose came home from the city, bringing her beau, a young professor who clearly adored her. They gathered around the large table Ryland had built, sharing food and stories and love. Looking around at the family she'd created, Adelaide felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This, all of this, had started because one mountain man had looked past her age and seen her worth, because he had been brave enough to pursue her and she had been brave enough to say yes. That night, lying in bed with Ryland's arms around her, Adelaide spoke into the darkness. "I love you. I don't say it enough, but I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone." "I know," Ryland murmured, his lips against her hair. "I've always known, just like you've always known how much I love you. It's in everything we do, every day we share." "Promise me something," Adelaide said, turning in his arms to face him. Anything. Promise me you'll never regret choosing me. Never regret that I couldn't give you children when I was younger, that I came to you with so much baggage and stubbornness and—" "Adelaide," Ryland interrupted, his voice firm. "Listen to me. You are perfect. You are perfect. Not in spite of your age or your independence or your strength, but because of those things. I wouldn't change a single thing about you or about our story. We found each other when we were supposed to, and we built something beautiful. No regrets, not a single one." Adelaide kissed him, pouring all her love into it, and Ryland kissed her back with the passion of a much younger man. Even after all these years, the spark between them hadn't dimmed. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by years of partnership and shared experiences. As Adelaide drifted off to sleep that night, safe in her husband's arms, she thought about the words those women had spoken so long ago. "She's too old for marriage." They had meant it as a condemnation, a pronouncement of her failure as a woman. But they had been so very wrong. Adelaide hadn't been too old. She had been exactly the right age for the love of her life to find her. She had been ripe for the kind of loving that Ryland Tucker had brought into her world, the kind that saw her, valued her, and cherished her for exactly who she was. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the opinions of narrow-minded gossips, not society's arbitrary timelines for when women should marry and have children, but the undeniable truth that love, real love, recognized no age limits or expiration dates. Adelaide Parker Tucker had found her happily ever after at 42, and she had lived it beautifully for every year since. She would continue living it, savoring every precious day with her mountain man until their story reached its natural conclusion. And when that day came, whenever it came, she would face it without regrets, knowing she had lived fully, loved deeply, and proved that it was never, ever too late for a woman to claim her happiness. The sun rose over the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and pink, and Adelaide woke in her husband's arms, ready to greet another beautiful day of the life they had built together. A life that had started with a mountain man walking into a store and seeing not a woman too old for love, but a woman perfectly ripe for his kind of loving. And he had been absolutely right.